All right, well, welcome and thank you everyone for joining us this morning for Coffee with the Collection. My name is Amanda. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Before we get started, let's go over a little housekeeping first. Everyone should be on mute right now, and I'd like to ask you all to keep yourselves muted so that we can hear our presenter without any distractions. But if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to do so using the chat feature. To open your chat, scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the icon that looks like a speech bubble. It should also say chat just underneath. Once you click that, a window will open to the side of your screen where you'll be able to type questions and comments, and we'll circle back around to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. So let's get started. First, I'd like to invite everyone to sit back, relax, grab your cup of coffee. Hopefully you have with you the RAM made available especially for this program through our friends at Black Camel Coffee, and it will continue to be available on their website after this program today. So we have a very special Coffee with the Collection planned for you with a little bit of a different perspective than previous discussions we've had. Traditionally, we explore an artwork or a series of works in the museum's collection with more of an art historical focus. And this morning, we're going to do a little bit of that, but we're also going to talk about the artwork and the artist in terms of how pieces like this are a really powerful resource for engaging with the university community, as well as our partners in the greater Oklahoma area. In the education department of the museum, I and my coworkers are constantly asking ourselves two major questions. And the first is, how do artworks in the museum's collection enhance instructors' educational goals for their students and classes in the university? And second, beyond the campus borders, how do artworks in the museum's collection provide meaningful examples of self-expression for all of our audiences? In order to give you a glimpse into how we strive to answer these questions every day, we'll take a look at the piece, The Sacrifice of Isaac by Menashe Kadishman, presented by my dear colleague and Professor Shmuel Shepkaru. I will chime in for a few moments just before the Q&A to talk a little bit about the impact of this piece through an educator's kaleidoscopic perspective. So now I'd like to introduce you all to Shmuel Shepkaru. Shmuel is the Schusterman Professor of Jewish Intellectual and Religious History. He's the author of the book Jewish Martyrs in the Pagan and Christian Worlds, published by the Cambridge University Press. He has written articles on a variety of topics and the editor of a volume on the Jews of Arab lands. He's been invited to present his work in the United States, Canada, Europe, Israel, and Japan. I met Shmuel a few years ago when he brought one of his classes to the museum, and we worked on connecting pieces in the museum's collection to their class discussions. And Shmuel, I just want to say that I thoroughly enjoy your visits every year. And thank you so much for being with us today. And I'm now going to officially hand the reins over to you.
Okay, so you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good morning. I'm happy to do this. I have your coffee mug. So I'm charged and ready to run. So I need to start with a disclaimer. I'm not an art historian. I'm a medievalist. And two of my research areas are martyrdom and the afterlife. When I first saw Kadishman's work on our campus, I got very excited. Not only did it remind me of Tel Aviv, the biblical story behind Kadishman's sculpture, Akedat Yitzhak, or in short, the Akedah, is highly relevant to my research. Akedat Yitzhak is commonly translated as the sacrifice of Isaac, but the phrase literally means the binding of Isaac. And this is a significant theological difference. The story is told in Genesis 22. In my opinion, this is one of the most moving and most beautiful written stories of the Old Testament. There are no extra words in the story. Nothing is superfluous. Each word conveys a strong message. And apparently, the artist behind this 6th century mosaic from Bet Alpha in northern Israel felt the same way. So what we can see here, and I'll try to use my arrow here, this is Isaac with his name in Hebrew, Yitzhak, the altar, Abraham with a very large knife. Here on top is the voice of God, In Judaism, you're not supposed to depict God. And this is the ram with his long horns caught in the bushes. To summarize Genesis 22, God asks Abraham to do the unthinkable. Take your son, your only son, the son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of the Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering. Apart from being inhumane, the command made no sense. Earlier in his life, God had ordered Abraham to depart from his father's house, his country, and go to this unknown land that God will show him. And in return, God promised Abraham to make him the father of a great and blessed nation. And as a bonus, he will curse his enemies as well. How can the promise be fulfilled then if Isaac is to be sacrificed? Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah, his wife, was no spring chicken either. She was 90 years old. The couple is not likely to have another child, although miracles can happen. Isaac is the only way God's promise can be fulfilled. And yet, Abraham does not question the command. He does not argue. He is completely obedient. Abraham was not a shy man. Before God destroyed the cities of sinners, Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham pleaded with God to rethink his decision. But when it came to his innocent son Isaac, he was completely compliant. Abraham's only response is, "Here I am," which is one word in Hebrew, "Hineni." Moreover, Abraham cannot wait to fulfill God's command. Abraham arises early in the morning, makes sure to take with him not only Isaac, but also everything he would need to complete his mission, even the wood, in case, God forbid, he could not find wood at the place of sacrifice. When they arrive, Abraham builds the altar, adds the wood, and binds Isaac on the altar. Abraham takes in his hand the knife, ready to slaughter his son. At this dramatic point, God orders him to stop. It was just a test. It was Abraham's test. Next, Abraham sees a ram caught in the thicket by his horns, and he offers the ram up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. Because Abraham stood the test and was ready to sacrifice his son, God blessed him again and promised to multiply his seed as the stars of the heaven and to always protect his descendants. In the Jewish tradition, the story is very significant. It reinforces God's eternal commitment to protect Israel. Symbolically speaking, in times of trouble, God will always provide a ram to substitute for the lives of the Isaacs of each generation. Several milestones in Kadishman's life explain his attraction to the story of the Akedat. Kadishman was born in 1932 in Tel Aviv, British Mandate Palestine. When he was 15 years old, his father, a pioneer with artistic talent, passed away. So Kadishman quit school and took up a job to support the family. At the same time, Kadishman took evening lessons from the painter Aaron Avni and the sculptor Moshe Sterenshus. And here is Kadishman again. In 1950, he was drafted to the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, and stationed at Kibbutz Ma'ayan Baruch near the Syrian-Lebanese border, and later at Kibbutz Israel. A kibbutz, as you may know, is a communal or collective farm based on socialist ideas. In both places, Kadishman worked as a shepherd. Kadishman said that being a shepherd enabled him to connect with nature and the land and think about his biblical ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who were all shepherds. So here is the shepherd with the biblical look, if you want, with the kafia or the head cover on the head, with the tunic looking over the sheep. Here's another slide with the same motif, the promised land. This one looks a little bit different. And if it looks familiar to you, you're right. This is Kadishman's homage to Millet. So you can see the resemblance here, resemblant here. And so now, millennia later, Kadishman felt he was following in Abraham's footsteps. Some people compared Kadishman's physical appearance to a biblical prophet. A prophet, perhaps, but a more accurate comparison would be with a 60s Israeli hippie. Kadishman was a large man, and this is not to say that all Israeli hippies were large, but almost always he was wearing a large white shirt, shorts, and always sandals or flip-flops. But the biblical scenery that Kadishman imagined when tending to the sheep was tainted by the barrier that marked the Israeli-Syrian border. Kadishman felt that the artificial border, the barrier, limited the sheep's freedom to roam around, as was the case in biblical times. The imperfect biblical imagery left an equally strong impression on Kadishman. In 1959, Kadishman left the Israeli scenery to study and work in London. He studied at St. Martin College of Art and Design and at the Slade School of Fine Art. While in England, he got married and had 2 children. They returned to Israel in 1972. A year later, the Yom Kippur War broke out, and Kadishman served as a driver in the medical corps. There is a story that during his military service, Kadishman saw a decomposed body and could not tell if it was an Israeli or an enemy fatality. The morbid encounter reinforced his view that all victims of war are tragic and unnecessary. Kadishman loved to paint sheep, literally. So here we see Kadishman with his curly hair, with his thick beard, with his shirt unbuttoned. He would button up his shirt for official occasions, when he got an award, for example, in shorts. I don't think he's wearing shoes this time, painting sheep. In the background, we see his daughter Maya, and I assume that sitting here is his son Ben. Shepherds in the kibbutz marked the sheep with blue paint on their back to identify them. In 1978, Kadishman was chosen to represent Israel in the Venice Biennale exhibition. When he arrived, he got himself a herd of sheep from a local farmer, brought it to the Israeli pavilion, took care of the sheep, fed it, watered it, and painted the sheep blue. Kadishman turned his sheep into his canvas. I should add that he was always careful to use non-toxic paint. As you know, the sheep also represents victimhood. Perhaps with the trauma of the Yom Kippur War still fresh in his mind, Kadishman originally wanted to paint the sheep red, the color of blood, in order to call attention to the human toll wars and violence took on Israeli society. But he was concerned that the bloody image might draw harsh criticism. After the Biennale exhibition, Kadishman painted thousands of sheep portraits. He never got tired of painting sheep because no two sheep were alike. Each sheep is an individual with its own personality and characteristics. They bear human expressions. Another thing about Kadishman, he didn't like to mix the paint. So each color stands almost alone as an individual color. The year 1982 was particularly difficult for Kadishman. His mother passed away. He underwent a difficult stomach surgery. The Lebanon War broke out, a very controversial war in the history of the modern state. And his son, Ben, was drafted to the military. As you may know, serving in the military is mandatory in Israel at the age of 18. Israeli men and women start to serve for about 3 years. When Ben was drafted, Kadishman, the father, felt guilty. Had he stayed in England, he could have spared Ben this war, which many Israelis considered an unnecessary war. With Ben going to war, Kadishman felt like Abraham sending his only son to be sacrificed. Ben was not alone, of course. Kadishman realized that all parents entered the same dangerous pact with Israeli reality from the moment their sons were born. Back then, women did not serve in combat unit. They do now. One more piece of information must be added here to understand Kadishman and his work. In 1973, the Tel Aviv Literature and Art Foundation invited the Jewish American artist George Segal to Israel and commissioned him to create a sculpture to be displayed at the concert hall, Echala Tarbut. Segal is famous for his pioneer work with plaster, which he used to create his monochromatic life-sized sculptures. Often, Segal used himself and his friends as models for his sculptures. In his visit to Israel, he asked his friend Kadishman to serve as a model for his sculpture of the Akedat. So here we see Kadishman with his chest exposed, barefoot, standing over his only son, Ben. And by the way, Ben in Hebrew means son. Kadishman holds a knife in his hand, clenching his fist. Ben lying naked on a stone cast from the Jerusalem mountains, looking innocent in dismay. The two stare at each other. Interestingly, Ben is untied and he looks almost angelic here. Around the Lebanon War, Kadishman started working on his own Akedat Yitzhak. Kadishman loved to work before an audience. He invited people to see him work, He would interact with his audience, let people ask questions, explain his choices of color or themes, talk about other artists, and so on. An Israeli TV correspondent visited Kadishman, who lived and worked in an apartment at the center of Tel Aviv. The journalist asked Kadishman what his next project was, and Kadishman showed him this. So here we see the ram and the round face. We will talk about the round face soon. And stones. The stones here are significant because they represent the grave. In the Jewish tradition, visitors to the grave leave small stone, not flower, although some people do both now. And in 1982, his Akedat Yitzhak was exhibited at the Museum of Art in Tel Aviv. The sculpture consists of 3 parts. The ram is the centerpiece. Now, how does the ram look to you? Does it look innocent? The ram looks evil to me. He's standing up, he's strong and menacing with his oversized horns. This is not the scared ram that got caught in the bushes from Genesis 22. There is something very manly about the biblical story of the Akedah. The phallic symbols scream. Abraham, the man, the long knife, the long horns. Here is the ram who encapsulates all these phallic symbols. Across from the ram is Isaac, Isaac's round, innocent face. His eyes and mouth open. He's lying on the ground, expressing surprise and perhaps pain. On the side are women. We can see them better here. This is also from the museum in Tel Aviv. In the story of the Akedah in Genesis 22, there are no women. Sarah, Isaac's mother, is not mentioned at all. We don't know if she knew of the divine command. We don't know if she knew that Abraham was going to kill her son. We don't know if she ever found out what happened on that mountain. We don't know if Isaac told her, hey mom, you can't believe what kind of game Dad and I played on that mountain. Is one of the women, Sarah. Kadishman inserted not one, but 2 women. They hold each other in grief and mourn. Why 2 women? They represent all the mothers who send their sons to war. From the first moment they hold their newborn baby, and this is another Kadishman, another work by him, they are aware of the harsh reality that requires them to offer their child. So here we see a mother giving birth to what looks like Isaac again, the round face. She is not a joyous mother. She is sad. And she is sad because she knows what is expected of her son. This is another work by Kadishman, and we see here actually a very strong mother lifting her son, not a baby, as if saying to God, here's my sacrifice, take him. Interestingly, this sculpture is from the Sheba Hospital in Ramat Gan So I think it's an interesting choice. And perhaps the two women convey another motif. No, that's not what I wanted. The women can be associated with the two Marys watching and mourning over Jesus' death. Who is missing here? Abraham. He's not in the picture. Perhaps the guilt-ridden new Abraham, that is Kadishman, prefers to hide. Let me go back here. Prefers to hide because he's the one who brought Ben/Isaac to the promised land and took him away from his mother in order to be sacrificed. Who else is missing? God. For Kadishman, this is not a religious sin. In contrast to the biblical promise, God does not intervene to save all the new Isaacs. Kadishman said in an interview, the ram won. So Kadishman's Akedat does not represent a test. It represents a reality. And it is no longer Abraham's test. Abraham is the only hero of Genesis 22, which ends on a positive note. For Kadishman, the real heroes, the tragic heroes, are the innocent young men and their mothers. Kadishman's Akedat Yitzhak turns the biblical story on its head, both figuratively and literally. So we can see here clearly that the ram is on top, the same menacing ram with Isaac below him. And this sculpture is from Tel Aviv University. And this is our Kadishman. As with his other versions, the sculpture is made of corten steel cut with laser. It's about 15 feet in size. And it's a gift by Dr. and Miss Simon Levite and family. I think it was given in 2003 or 5. Corten steel is a type of steel that is used for the outdoor. It doesn't need paint, and it rusts fairly quickly. So the ram is on the top, standing proudly with his oversized horns, displaying his strength, masculinity, evil intentions. Isaac, with his innocent round face, is beneath the ram, expressing surprise and pain. His hands resemble Jesus' crucifixion. And clearly, here again, the ram won this tragic contest. By now, Kadishman is famous around the world. In 1995, Kadishman received his Israeli prize. And I would like to add one more work by Kadishman called Shalekhet, Fallen Leaves. This one is from the Jewish Museum in Berlin. The room is covered with 10,000 round faces made of steel and cut with laser. The same image of Isaac that Kadishman used for Akedat Yitzhak. The visitors are invited to walk on the discs, which creates an eerie experience. Sorry, here we go. Now, when we see an exhibit like this by a Jewish artist in Germany, we think of the Holocaust. But Kadishman dedicated this exhibit to all victims of violence around the world. Back to our Kadishman, when I bring students to the museum, we stand next to the sculpture, and the museum is a great resource for us. When you stand next to it, to the sculpture, you feel that it is a menacing sculpture. The size of this metal construction is overwhelming. As you know, one of the first things they tell you at the museum is that you cannot touch the exhibit. In one of my visits, Amanda joined our group and she encouraged us to touch the sculpture. You touch it and it swings, which adds to the feeling of dread. You feel as if the whole thing might collapse. And worse, this evil ram might crush you. The sculpture is well balanced, of course. And perhaps the swinging of the sculpture represents the delicate balance Kadishman was seeking. A balance between humans and nature and art, myth and reality, and life and death. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shmuel. Oh my gosh, that was absolutely fascinating. And thanks for sharing all that information and your perspective. Before we get to the Q&A, so don't leave anyone if you have a chance to stay, there's just a little bit more information that I want to go over. One of the things that we tend to not talk too much about that I'd like to highlight a little bit is how we acquired this piece. So what I'm going to do is, Shmuel, if you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and I'm going to share a little video that's just going to kind of go around the sculpture so we can see it from all angles. If I can get there. Okay. All right. And while we're watching that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we acquired this piece. So the Sacrifice of Isaac was gifted to the museum in 2005 by Dr. and Mrs. Simon Levitt of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dr. Levitt first saw the sculpture installed in the New York City Central Park, and he was so moved when he saw it that he called Kadishman and asked if he could buy it. And so once he purchased it, the Levitt family had the sculpture delivered to their home in Tulsa via an oil rig company. And mainly because they knew that this would be the only way that they could actually properly install this 15-foot sculpture in their backyard. So as the story goes, at first the workers were kind of confused when they saw all of the pieces, and they called Dr. Levitt in his office. They said, excuse me, sir, I think they've sent us the wrong thing. And so once Dr. Levitt explained and reassured, no, these are actually the right pieces, and once they got everything put together, he explained the meaning of the work to the workers. And he says, quote, one of the guys became really quiet and told me his son was serving in Desert Storm at that time, end quote. And later that weekend, the men returned with their wives and their families, eager to share the sculpture. And Levitt later noted that, quote, it had reached across a galaxy on the back of a flatbed truck, end quote. So a few weeks ago, when I read that section about the impact that this work had on a military family, I immediately thought about a group of veterans that I work with once a month for the past 2 years at the Oklahoma City VA hospital. And so I wondered if this piece could spark an important conversation with my friends at the VA. In fact, a few of my friends from the VA are here with us this morning. Hello, thanks for coming. So just a few days ago, we virtually met and we talked about this artwork. I shared images and kind of let the discussion unfold naturally without trying to steer the conversation in any particular direction. Almost immediately, the group mentioned the idea of the viewer as Abraham. We talked about Kadishman placing the viewer in Abraham's role and Abraham in the role of the spectator. And one of the members of the group she mentioned, we're all watching this scene unfold before us and unsure of how to react. What do we do in this moment? The group talked about the rawness of the material, the support structure, and the rivets that are not hidden from view as one would expect. To a few participants, this exposure of the elements felt significant to the act of binding Isaac, and that everything is tied to the boy and his fate as Isaac's form literally holds the entire sculpture together. So after this discussion concluded, everyone worked on a creative exercise to allow an opportunity for visual expression. And I'm extremely grateful that 2 participants were happy to share what they created. And using metallic cardstock, I gave the group the prompt to cut out their own silhouette shape, motif, or symbol that was of special significance to them. I'm going to share that with you all. Oop, there we are. So here we have 2 really great examples. The one on the left is called Clever Eye, and the one on the right is currently untitled, I've been told, but it is a depiction of a phoenix rising from the ashes. I'm always so impressed with this group. And I want to borrow a quote from the recreation therapist that I work with on this program. Hi, Sandy, if you're here. But she describes what we're doing not as art therapy, but therapy through art. And this idea really resonates with me and my educational philosophy, is that there is a lot to be learned from artwork that goes beyond its historical significance. We can learn how artists were able to use their creative processes to communicate their own stories, and how this can be an example as a way for any of us to express ourselves visually when other forms of communication are more difficult. I think the Levitt family would be happy to know that not only is this piece highly appreciated within the university community and academia, but this and others like it within the museum's collection provide powerful moments for self-reflection and expression with many individuals that we work with. So one other thing I want to do is, okay, so Shmuel showed everyone the Fallen Leaves installation, and actually this piece here, this face on the right, this is within the museum's collection. And the way that we acquired this is really kind of fascinating. When the Levitt family donated the Sacrifice of Isaac sculpture to us, the director of the museum at the time reached out to Kadishman and let him know that this was going to be installed on the university campus and invited him to come visit. And Kadishman, being an extremely generous individual, replied by sending this face in the mail to the museum. And this is a piece that is from this installation. So it's a part of the Fallen Leaves. So it's quite fascinating that in Oklahoma, you can see a portion of this larger installation. So we are quite fortunate to have this. And then one other, this is another piece that we have in our collection by Kadishman. So as Shmuel was explaining, Kadishman has painted so many portraits of sheeps over the years, and we do have one. And this is on the right, an inscription that he wrote on the back of the painting. And I think it's a really lovely explanation of sort of this benevolent taking care of God's creatures and the way that he felt. And the images on the left, these are pretty fascinating. So this is from an installation in 1998 in Bangkok, Thailand, but I think it also went to other locations as well. But this was called The Herd. And so this is over 400 portrait paintings of different sheeps. And instead of exhibiting them on a wall, as one would imagine, Kadishman decided that he was going to exhibit them on either the ground or the floor. And the idea is that as the visitor, you would walk through this in order to see all of the paintings. You would have to walk amongst the herd in order to see them. And so quite a really fascinating idea, I think. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, so now we're back to our Q&A section. If anyone has a question that you would like to ask Shmuel or myself or both of us, feel free to open your chat and enter it there. But before we do that, I do have a quick question for you, Shmuel, while everyone is typing. So you mentioned a little bit about bringing your class to the museum to look at the Kadishman. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how does the museum add to your class as a resource when you're teaching?
Yeah, so I bring my students at least once a year or once a semester, at least to the museum. Usually students of my classes in a course on martyrdom and a course on heaven and hell. And when the students, first of all, the students love to come to the museum. And so when we see the exhibits, we see how people imagine the themes and the topics that we discuss in class. So of course, Kadishman is a prime example of sacrifice and the toll it takes on people. And it brings history to life when the students are at the museum. If they look at a painting that is about heaven or the afterlife, then the text they read in class becomes alive. And so the museum is a great resource, and my students are always excited to visit the museum. We are extremely fortunate to have the museum.
Well, and we're extremely fortunate to have classes like yours come through. And your students are always really engaging when they come. It's certainly not crickets. We have a nice conversation every time, which I really appreciate. You know, I have another question for you. So we touched briefly on, you know, the fact that Abraham is not present in any of those images. And so, you know, I thought it was really interesting, the idea that you were talking about as Kadishman kind of seeing himself as the Abraham kind of character. I wonder how much, I'm trying to envision, and I don't really know what my question is, so I'm just kind of rambling at this point. But I wonder how differently those sculptures would be if he had somehow incorporated himself or that Abraham figure in some way. I mean, I don't know, what do you think? Would it have changed the entire meaning in some way for you?
Yeah, I think so, because the focus of his work is the women. Mm-hmm. And unlike the biblical story, the women are the real heroes, the heroines. They are the one who make the sacrifice. And there's something a bit even sneaky about Abraham. He's taking his son. We don't know if he told Sarah about it at all. And Abraham and Kadishman had his family in England. He schleps them all the way to the promised land, and for what, right? So I think he doesn't want to be in the picture.
Mm. Gotcha. Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Gosh. Does anyone have any questions? Let's see. Oh, okay, here's one from Leslie Hobson says, what does the sculpture say about afterlife to your students?
well, when the theme of Jesus' sacrifice comes up, then the possibility of an afterlife comes up as well, because Jesus' story doesn't end with his death. It's actually starting with his death, really. That's the resurrection, and then later on the ascension. So when you connect the Kadishman's Akedat Yitzhak to the Christian motifs, then there is the possibility of the afterlife. I don't think Kadishman was a very religious man, although his daughter Maya said that they celebrated some of the holidays. They also celebrated Christmas, I think she said, when they were in England. But I think Kadishman's Akedat Yitzhak is also a political statement. And it's a political statement, and perhaps also an anti-religious statement. Not in the sense that he didn't like religion, but some of the messages that we get through religion are not exactly the messages that fit our needs and reality sometimes. So he was torn, I think, between these two poles.
Yeah, I had read somewhere that there was a scholar who was sort of comparing Kadishman's work as kind of a bridge between religious kind of theological ideas and current nowadays times, as kind of this overarching connecting between the two. There's another question that Angela's asking. So do you know what happened with Kadishman's son with his service in the army?
Yeah, he was fine. He was fine. He's a painter too. His daughter Maya is an I think actress. Went into also show business. She's a writer. But yeah, they're fine. Ben is fine. And shortly after Kadishman passed away, both of them took some of his works and had an exhibition in Tel Aviv, and they were a little bit torn about it because they didn't know if the works were ready, if Kadishman wanted to show the works, but they did, and it was a very successful exhibition. But yeah, Ben survived the war, and he was fine.
Excellent. Oh, nice. It looks like, so Daniel has shared with us, let's see, a link to Stephen Mitchell reimagining the binding of Isaac in 5 different variations, including Sarah in the story. Thank you for that, Daniel. I will copy that link and send that out to everyone in an email with the recording as well, if you all want to take some time to check that out later. But Daniel is asking a question also. So he wants to know, do we know what Kadishman's wife thought of the sculpture? Did you ever see anything about her?
That's an excellent question. Yeah. That's an excellent question. So when I did my little research about Kadishman, and there are a lot of interviews, a lot of articles, a lot of interviews with his children, the wife is hardly mentioned. I know they got divorced. I don't know when. I found an interview with Maya, his daughter. I'm not sure even if it was a local TV in some town. I think it was Haifa. And then for the first time, I heard her talking about mom, about the mother. So that's a mystery to me too. I don't think she attended his funeral. I don't know if she was alive. Kadishman died when he was 82. In the interview that Maya mentioned the mother, she showed one picture. She was English, British, but that's all I know. And I think that adds to the complexity
Mm-hmm.
Of bringing her son to the promised land and offering him.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be nice to know what her thoughts were for sure.
But even in the when they talk about his death and his family, the wife is missing, kind of in Genesis 22.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Oh gosh, very true. Well, thank you so much, Shmuel. I don't see any more questions from anyone unless anybody has any last minute comments. I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you everybody for joining us this morning. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget to mark your calendars for the next Coffee with the Collection on Friday, May 21st at 9:30 in the morning, featuring Lenora Carrington's Friday, presented by Delana Trim. She's the Curator of Collections at the Maybe-Gur Museum of Art. And I also want to mention another virtual program featuring one of our current exhibitions, Long Exposure, A Century of Pictorialism, that will be presented by the curator of that exhibit, Dr. Hadley German. And this will be on Friday, May 7th at 3 p.m. I'll send out the recording from today's discussion, and I'll be sure to include the links that were shared earlier in the program, as well as the links to register for those upcoming events. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. We hope you have a wonderfully creative weekend, and thank you so much, Shmuel. It was fantastic to talk with you.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.